Extract 6. Violet Frankenstein. Date 1800s. The intruder was one of the men from the town. He was soaked through, and when he was several yards into the cave, he leant against a wall and sobbed. I was still full of fear and anger, but a speck of compassion grew in my heart as I saw the sorrow and pain on his face. Yet I still didn't dare to reveal myself in case there was treachery in his misery. After a few minutes, he slumped to the floor and continued to sob. As I debated what to do, I was caught by some twist of fate. A need to sneeze took me. I tried to hold it and conceal the sound, but the small stutter was amplified by the cave. The man, who was about 20 years of age, darted his head in my direction and stood up quickly. "Who's there?" he called, backing towards the exit. Stepping from the shadows, I hesitated, and he spoke before I could decide what to say. "You," he stuttered, and broke down in tears. Through the tears, I managed to decipher his words. "I'm so sorry." A sudden passion came over me, and I shouted at him. "Where's my mother? What were those monstrous men? Why do you want to hurt women so much?" He breathed deeply, trying to compose himself. "Your mother is dead," he managed to say. "And the others?" I uttered in disbelief. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I never wanted anything like this to happen." His apology said it all. I managed to stumble to my rock and sat on it, holding my head in my hands. He took a few steps towards me. "They are looking for you, but this should be far enough away that they do not find us. Can you forgive me for my part in this?" he pleaded. I couldn't speak. He took the silence as an invitation to say more, and I listened while trying to digest my pain and loss. My mother was dead. "My name is Percy," he said. "I was raised in a village not far from here, and like all the men, was seen as inferior to women. It's no excuse for what has taken place here, and what I've been a part of, but I need you to understand so you don't think me so wicked. Many times we joked about having a more equal standing with the women, but it was only a dream. Then one day a man from our village told us how he had met the patriarch of these giants. At first he had been frightened by the shocking sight, but the patriarch talked to him and spoke of the things we joked about, and how he would show us the way. All we wanted was the equality we thought he offered, so we followed him and found he had other followers from other villages. We listened to his story and the story of his sons. There were times when we saw sparks of cruelty in them, but these were overshadowed by our wishes and his promises of help. Eventually, I saw his true colours with the punishments he dealt out to women of other villages. I wanted to run, but I didn't, for the fear of what would happen to me. I didn't know what the other men thought about what was going on, and I was scared to say anything. In the chaos of tonight's horrors, I finally decided to flee in the hope I could get away and not be a part of their murderous mission to subject women to them. It's not what we wanted. I cannot believe they would all want this. If I had known all that would happen, I would never have met the giants." As he talked, I gained some control of the pain. All this stemmed from how women treated men. I struggled to see what he meant. My mother had always loved my father and treated him with a great deal of kindness. I had always been a good woman and done my part. I confronted Percy. "Equality? What do you mean? We have our roles to play as women and men." There was a pause as he thought about what to say. "What is your name?" he finally asked. The question wasn't what I expected, but I answered it, and then he answered my questions. "Violet. There doesn't need to be roles or specific categories for women and men, and the ones we do have give all the choices and options to women. Do you see that, Violet? Women can follow careers, be involved in society freely. They have the final word on everything, and at times they can be very cruel, whereas men are confined to the housekeeping and raising children and having to do all they are told. Is this fair and equal?" I could see the passion in his voice and body language. He watched me as I dissected his passionate speech. A silence fell between us. I took this time to think about it all. What he said made sense. There is a limited amount of choice men have because of the rules society followed. And in many cases I have seen that men were required to be subordinate to women. But it is just the way it is. Through my new awareness and seeing his pain and passion, part of me started to forgive him for all that had happened. Furthermore, he had fled from them and confessed to me all this, so I could not be angry with him. I was angry at the monsters for what they had done and how, for a reason I couldn't completely fathom, they had twisted this idea of equality into a plan to reap misery on all women. My only concern now was to stop them. I forgive your part in this, Percy, I began, breaking the silence. All that matters is stopping these monsters. If we make it to a more populated town, we can bring armed women here and end this. I know where we need to go. We should leave at first light, he replied. Percy is resting now as I write. I will have to rally women, and even writing women gives me pause and sparks a tapestry of thoughts and feelings. But now is not the time to explore these. I will find the women and convince them of the existence of the monsters. I'll rid the world of this plague as my mother wished. I don't know what to do with the babies, as they are surely innocent in all this. It will require more thought. I'm also partially concerned as to what has happened to the original female monster my mother created, but there is no way of knowing. Dawn is approaching, and the nightmare continues. Extract 7. Violet Frankenstein. Date 1800s. We have made it to some resemblance of civilization. I might almost believe last night to be a dream. My head is throbbing this morning, and I've been piecing together the events of last night, the effects of too much drink hindering me in this task. When we arrived, Percy and I booked ourselves into rooms at the local guest house. I struggled to sleep, so decided a drink might relax me. The plan was to speak to the locals the following day and explain our ordeal. I made my way to the tavern, and once inside, I took my drink to a corner table. I sat in the shadows and tried not to think of all that had happened, and all I must still attempt. It was as I took my second drink that a strangely dressed gentlewoman entered and walked to the bar. I had read of these cowgirls of the Wild West, but didn't expect one to be this far north. What stood out first was the large brimmed hat shadowing her face, and the long leather coat that almost swept the floor. The coat appeared black, but as she moved, it seemed to change to a lighter grey, and even brown at times. She glanced in my direction, and the light finally revealed her face. A face that looked young and old, beaten and soft, caring and hateful. And as she looked at me, I saw her eyes, and tried not to gasp. One normal eye looked back at me, and the other was what appeared to be a glass eye, as white as snow. Before I could compose myself and look away, she gave a half smile. She stroked her chin and walked towards me. I looked around nervously, trying to pretend that I hadn't been staring, and took a sip of my drink as casually as I could. I then felt her shadow over me, and I looked up. Good evening, I managed. Good evening, she replied, with a full smile this time. Her accent twanged with casual confidence, but also with an underlying sophistication. Forgive me for the intrusion, she continued, but you look like you have a story to tell, and I'm in the mood for a tale. Do you mind sharing it with a weary traveller? Not to be rude, ma'am, but how do you know I've a story to tell? I asked. Call it a skill, she replied. May I join you? She swept her long cloak under the table as she sat. It was now more brown than black. Removing her hat, she placed it on the table to reveal short, light hair. My name is Joan Idaho Thatcher, she said as she sat, and we engaged in some polite conversation about our backgrounds. She listened in a way I don't think anyone had ever listened before. It was as though every word was important to her, and she was recording it to memory, what I was saying. I must confess, it was good to talk so openly to someone who truly listened. We drank several more strong drinks as we talked, and she paid for them all, refusing my offers by saying it was good to share her recent good fortune. So what's your story then? She finally said, in that twang I was growing to find very pleasant. You probably wouldn't believe it, I said. I can be very open-minded, she replied. I felt I could be open, although it may have been the drink. I relayed my story and told her of my mother's diary, the monsters and the patriarch's hate for women, and how they had killed my mother and many others before I fled, and how I met Percy. I also spoke of the children they had, and as I unfolded the tale, she seemed fascinated by it. When I finished, she sat back. Well, that's quite a story, she said, so loudly that it disrupted the silence of the now empty tavern. You believe me? I asked, pondering a last drink and tipping my glass slightly, emphasizing its emptiness. Of course, she replied. Twisting in her seat, she called out, Barkeep, one last drink for Violet, if you would be so kind. How do you know it's true? Call it another skill, she said, giving her warm yet sly half-smile. I can help you take care of these monsters. The barkeep came over at the same time and placed a new drink in front of me. I said my thanks, but kept my eyes forward, waiting to hear how she could help. She didn't answer, and seemed to be waiting for me to ask again. The suspense was too much, so I complied. How will you kill them? And what will you do with the babies? I asked. I remember a slight flash of disapproval in her face. Then she pulled her coat aside, and I followed her gaze. I couldn't help noticing a strange kind of waistcoat she had on. It was made of a thick, hard-looking material, and covered in thin, intricate gold, silver, and copper cogs, and all connected by copper wires that wrapped around her torso and her back. They all came from a center point in the middle of her chest, and from what looked like a curious brooch of a white dove. It was about the size of the palm of my hand. It had the same cogs and wires over the surface, and almost looked alive. I continued to follow her gaze, down to her hip, and saw a pistol in a holster. Huh, you'll need more than that, I laughed, and took a swig of my drink. It would surprise you what this can do, she said, and suddenly stood up. Watch, she continued, and pulled the strange-looking pistol from her hip. She turned a dial on the side. It made a click-click-click sound, like a watch being wound. Taking her empty glass, she placed it at the far end of the room and put some coins on the bar. Compensation, she said to the barkeep. Striding to our table, she turned back and pointed the weapon at the glass. She fired it, and a small ball of what looked like blue lightning shot across the room and melted the glass. It continued to melt and made a hole in the table. The glass had vanished. She holstered the weapon, strode to the bar again, and placed another coin on the table. For your discretion, and she winked. Returning her to her seat, she said, That's one of its settings, at a low power. It'll take care of your problem of the violent creatures. I was stunned. I stood up and walked over to the table and put my hand through the hole. Incredible, I remarked. Returning, I stood by our table and drank what was left of my drink. What about the babies? I asked again. I have somewhere I can take them, where they will be safe and away from any cruelty. This way they can grow in a beautiful and loving environment. I will keep a close eye on them too, so don't you worry. So tomorrow we shall return and take care of them, I said. She stood. Not we, but I. I looked at her. You can trust me, Violet. I'll solve this problem. I promise you that. I'll find you when it's done. What you must do is leave with Percy. Listen to him, Violet. He sounds like an inspired man, and the equality he speaks of is possible. I must get some rest now. Take care of yourself, Violet, and I'll see you again. She lifted her hat and turned to leave. It was such an abrupt ending to the hours we had conversed that I simply replied, And you, Joan. Good luck. As the word luck left my lips, the door of the tavern swung shut behind her. With her gone, I sat down to think about all that had happened. Would she really help me? Would she kill the monsters? I have to accept that killing them is the best option for the human race, though it does sadden me that it could not have been resolved another way. I hope the babies will be safe too. Even though they appeared to be of the same larger stature, they are still babies. A few minutes went by, and my thoughts turned to my adventure, filled as it was with horrors. But I was interrupted by a cough from the barkeep. I realized she wanted to end her long night. I left and made my way to my room at the guest house. Slumping on my bed, I had fallen asleep without any trouble. It is morning now, and I must go see Percy.